You're watching Economics Amplified, the latest thinking on the biggest issues from UChicago's Becker Friedman Institute.
Hello, everybody. If we can all get settled, certainly you can keep on munching because this is the Friedman Forum with lunch. Welcome. This is the Becker Friedman Institute for Economic Research's Friedman Forum, created in order to get our prime researchers in contact with undergraduates, because the mission of the Becker Friedman Institute is to support research on campus. And what's research without research assistants, right? Okay. So we are extremely glad to be hosting Hugo Sonnenschein. First thing is there will be 2 more Friedman Forums this year. One will be Michael Greenstone talking on the subject of environmental economics. And the spring one will be Amy Finkelstein from MIT. And we'll see what topic she chooses. So you know the phrase, Hugo Sonnenschein is so well known, he needs no introduction. I'm going to ignore that one. That always makes me cringe. Now, for this audience of undergraduates, you may have heard that he has been teaching game theory, right? So you know him as a professor of game theory. You've come to the university slightly too late to know him as president of the university. Let me expand a bit so that you can share with me all the things that it means to me to be introducing Hugo. With my career advisory hat on, let's review Hugo's career slightly. He started with a University of Rochester college degree, and even then you interacted with Lionel Mackenzie, famous theoretician. He went and got his PhD from Purdue University, and from then his professor track led him from Minnesota to UMass, to Northwestern, and to Princeton. And there he was, you can see his CV is filled with research papers on theory. A slight diversion, he went to UPenn and became dean of social sciences there, right? Of the whole arts and sciences. And then from there, provost at Princeton. And then the pinnacle of this is president, of course, of University of Chicago. But I bring up that career because I want you to take a few pointers from looking at what Hugo has done. I think the first thing you might draw from this is go work hard and keep going until you find something better to do. The second one is from watching his leadership in his presidential role here at the University of Chicago. I think one of the things that I learned watching that process was that institutions don't really like to change. What Hugo showed me was that a good leader can actually listen and make the hard choices. Institutions sometimes don't respond as quickly as we expect economic decision makers to change, even in the face of financial imperatives. But in the course of creating that change from what university should look like before, and let me remind you that we used to have 2/3 graduate students and 1/3 undergraduates. That's not what we are now, right? Does everybody know the fractions now? Even counting the professional schools, we're much more half and half, right? The undergraduate program has grown largely. So the University of Chicago has been shaped very much by Hugo's work as a president. And what I learned in terms of leadership is that you do have to make hard choices. I've heard Hugo talk about the transition and the kickback that he got in trying to take the university on a new path. And he actually shared this with a general audience, so I don't feel like I shouldn't share this. But somebody came up to him, an alumni of the university, and said, as he started on this presidential shift of policy, "Don't ruin it," they said to Hugo. And I think that when we look now at what the university is, he not only didn't ruin it, but he enabled its growth and continued success. So what you see now is this burgeoning top undergraduate program that constitutes half of the student population is really what Hugo did as president. Since then, he's taught game theory. So you may know him as just the guy who teaches game theory, one more faculty member, but that's all post-presidential. So in that role, he's sent a wonderful number of students onto theory careers like Simon Lazarus, Suraj Maladi, Jonathan Libgover, and the list goes on and can include you. So sorry I took up so much time, but I really felt I needed to say this. Lars Hansen would have been here giving this talk, except he's wearing his statistics hat today. So you go.
So you get me. Thank you. Thank you very much, Grace. So, you know, since all of these things were said in the introduction, which are not really about the talk that I'm going to give, I do want to make a bit of a comment about your university and my university. What's really great about the University of Chicago, and what's been great through its history, is its values and its ability to execute on those values. So this is a university that really understands what a great university should be. And too few universities in our country and in the history of higher education in this country have understood that well. And you just hear that every day as you walk around campus. It's the values, it's our belief in thinking, in scholarship, and in what we do. So that's the part that you have to remember. And I must say, I sometimes get a little bit embarrassed when period of change and undergraduate growth came along with Chicago being that much more attractive. And there are financial imperatives as well. But it's really the values that are important. And maintaining those values, enhancing them, being able to afford them, which is not entirely easy, is what I care about. I'm sure it's what you care about. So that's not what this is about. I have the great luxury of being invited to present this talk, which is going to be really quite an informal talk, very much not a class. I hope you'll just munch along. I hope you'll ask questions. There are elements of what I'm going to speak about that you know very well. And you're a very diverse group. You range from freshmen to seniors and beyond. So to do something which works for all of you is a bit of a challenge. But I'm going to be speaking about very basic issues. I'm going to be speaking about the history of thought to some extent. And I'm going to be speaking very much from the heart. I'll actually be using, I won't get quite as far as long but I'll be using some slides that I used in research lectures that I just gave in Japan and were used here in a conference a couple of weeks ago when it was delivered by one of my co-authors. So the research part of this is joint work with Matt Jackson, who was once my student at Princeton, very distinguished scholar at Stanford, his graduate student, I-Ching Singh, who I've spent a lot of time with during the last 2 years, and Christos Tambassos, who is a professor at Monash University, and Omar Al-Ubaidli, who's in Bahrain and studied here, got his PhD here. So there's an element of this which is research, there's an element of this which is just an introduction to what I think economics is most basically about, and what is too easy for you to forget that we're about, because we just are so eager to put into your heads difficult analytic material that you really need in order to understand modern day economics. But it is very important to start at the beginning and understand how economics developed, a little bit of what we know and what we don't know, and to focus on these basic questions. So, you know, the basic questions, these are quotes that you know, but you should read and you should pay attention to. There's Adam Smith's statement about the invisible hand. The first statement is actually a weaker statement than the second one that I have there. The natural effort of every individual to better his own condition is so powerful that it is alone and without any assistance not only capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity, but to surmounting 100 impertinent obstructions with which the folly of human laws too often encumbers its operation. It's a very strong statement. And if you look to the modern counterpart, and now I'm sort of leaning on what those of you who have been around for a little while here have been taught, you know, the formal expression of that is the idea of a price-guided equilibrium, a Walrasian equilibrium, and the theorem that Walrasian equilibrium are Pareto efficient, at least when you don't have externalities, when you don't have monopolistic elements. You know, and the conclusion about Pareto efficiency is a very narrow conclusion about an economy doing well. As many of you know, means you can't make anybody better off in allocation without making somebody else less well off. So it says nothing about the distribution of income. And in fact, Adam Smith was very concerned about the distribution of income. And he wrote a celebrated treatise, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he expressed his caring about the distribution of income. You know, hard for a society to be a successful society with great inequality. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So that's a statement about the distribution of income. And in fact, at the time that Smith was writing, if you wanted to know how people felt about people doing the best for themselves, as opposed to being concerned individually with the social good, there are images that are rather wonderful, and you can see these in art, where there's a table that has huge and wonderful amounts of food, and everybody could be fed quite nicely at this table. Everybody at the table, it's a round table, has a long fork. And they have a problem. If they reach in and take some of the food and try and feed themselves, the forks are so long that it goes right by their ear. But on the other hand, if they'll stab in and give it to the person who's opposite them, if they share it and do things that way, thinking about others, everybody will come out fat and happy. You know, that's an important historical image. And in fact, the idea that people being selfish, doing the best for themselves will promote the social good is a somewhat outrageous idea. And if you look at what leading economists are talking about these days and what a lot of who knows about behavioral economics? Put your hands up. Who likes behavioral economics? Who finds it pretty intriguing? Who's been taught some of it in class? Who's suspicious? Well, I really want, I don't care that you actually answer, but I want you to be thinking about this kind of thing. It's interesting because there's a book by Thaler of our Booth School, very celebrated, entitled Misbehaving, which is a history of behavioral economics. And before that, he wrote a book, Nudge, with Cass Sunstein, who was a member of this faculty. I'll be leading a panel, not leading a panel, I'll be a moderator. I'll be with him on a stage and in a dialogue with him on Monday. And this week I traveled to Canada, and I was with George Akerlof. And Akerlof and Schiller, each individually and for different reasons, won the Nobel Prize. But they've just authored a book where it's all about behavioral economics, and it's all about the idea that you should be mistrustful about the idea that people doing the best for themselves will promote the social good, partly because we don't know what's good for us. I'm actually pretty good at some elements of behaving like economic and rational man. I'm rather good at deferring consumption. I was good at saving for my children's education and for the house that I wanted to live in. But if you put a bowl of cashews in front of me, I just turned to cottage cheese. And you know, this idea that, well-documented, true, that you could have a world where people were told by distinguished scientists that smoking isn't bad for you, just enjoy it. And you had the most prominent statistician of the day and really very important scientists backing this idea. And we're subject to all sorts of advertising. So I have 3 daughters. This is very informal talk. Okay. One's an investment banker, had a career at Goldman Sachs. One's a marketing person. The third is a benefits consultant. They were all math majors in college. But this idea that there's an element of selling people things which may not be the best for them, this is going on right now quite a bit with Coca-Cola. I don't know whether you follow this. I love Coca-Cola. I'm actually pretty good at not drinking tons of Coca-Cola, but there was a time when I had quite a bit of it. And I have a bit of a pot, which I'm trying to lose right now. And the amount of sugar in these drinks, and Coca-Cola in particular, is just massive. And there's quite a debate going on, and there's quite a lot of scientists involved in this debate on both sides. But there should be no mistaking that Coca-Cola has it in its interest to make you feel that drinking tons of it is not so bad for you. And I'm not going to opine on how bad it is for you, but that Coca-Cola is interested in having you feel that the more Coke, the merrier. And it's very tasty stuff, I think is indisputable. So, if you start with the idea that we don't know what's best for ourselves, then somehow you should expect that people doing what's best for themselves will not necessarily promote the social good, that's not an unreasonable idea. You're at a great university. Economics has a particular slant on things. Political science has a different slant. Sociology a different slant. Psychology a different slant. Mathematics and statistics, you'll learn tools. You at the end of the day have to have a healthy skepticism, and you have to figure out what is right and important, and you should be pushing back. The more you push back, the better. And one of the great things about teaching undergraduates, especially here, and I've taught undergraduates at the best places. I must also tell you, I spent most of my career teaching graduate students and not undergraduates. But with undergraduates, you have healthy skepticism. You haven't yet bought into all our stories. Don't buy into all our stories, particularly if you want to do the work that later gets recognized big time. And you're capable of doing that. We at Chicago have seen more than our share of the development of those kinds of young people. So be skeptical. Let me start then in terms of something a little bit more formal with the prisoner's dilemma. This is the prisoner's dilemma. Who hasn't heard of the prisoner's dilemma? Who feels very confident of their understanding? Hand up high. Nah, so if it was a real class, I make it all add up to one. I'm going to tell you a way, and I'll only use 30 seconds, to never forget the prisoner's dilemma, and it's a different story than you're used to, and I'm going to do it with the two of you. And it works this way. I have 2 envelopes, and I'm going to hand these envelopes to you. I'm also going to give you $1, okay? And then what you can do is you can put the $1 in the envelope, or you can put it in your pocket. And I'm not going to see what you do, okay? And then when you finish that act, you're going to hand the envelopes to me, and I'm going to turn around, and if there's $1 in an envelope, I'm going to add another $1. So if you gave me the envelope with $1 in it, I'm going to add another $1. There'll be $2 in it. If you gave me one without the $1 in it, I'm not going to add anything. I'm going to then switch envelopes, and I'm going to give you the envelope that the other person had originally with my additional contribution or not. These are the payoffs from the prisoner's dilemma. It's very easy to figure out that the only thing that you can do that is smart if you don't care about the other person, which is our typical maintained hypothesis, is to put the $1 in your pocket. It's the best action whether or not the other person is putting the $1 in the envelope or in their pocket. So a non-banana head who doesn't care about what the other person gets will put the $1 in their pocket, and the payoffs, therefore, will be that they each get $1. Whereas if they, quote, cooperated and both put $1 in the envelope, they'd each get $2, but they can't do it. And that's the game theorists' basic push to have you understand that people doing the best for themselves may not promote the social good. It's the analog writ into game theory of the people with the forks, okay? So that's the starting point. You all know that. We're going to run by that. What I want to talk about is what game theory has to say about this, quote, big problem of whether when people come together to engage in some kind of strategic situation, the result of their doing the best for themselves will promote the social good. And that's a different problem than Adam Smith was thinking of. He was thinking of the world, and it's different than the, quote, Arrow de Breu world and the theorem that Walras equilibria are efficient. And it's the beginnings of a research line that I've been interested in with my colleagues and that I want to introduce you to and talk about today. So one of the ways of thinking about this problem, let me go back a little bit. This is a very basic problem. In 2008, we had a real financial meltdown in this country. And if you take macro course, it should be if you take any course, you'll see a certain amount of people scratching their head and saying, we really have to understand that better than we understand it well. And if you hang around the economics department, which I encourage you to do, or you hang around Booth, you'll just see lots of people who are trying to figure out what happened and tell stories about it. and trying to understand the extent to which we should let things be as they are, or regulate more. And you know, if you decide to regulate, it's not clear that the cure will be better than the disease. Most people will agree that what happened in 2008 was not a very good event. Not just because of unemployment and which spiked up in this country and went from 5% to 10%, now back to 5%. In Spain, went to 25%, still around 25%, with youth unemployment at 50%. You know, these are large and significant numbers. It's disturbing. It should bother you. As economists, it should bother you because you want to understand it. I mean, forget about the bothering you because these are real people. That should bother you too, I would argue. But it also should bother you because, you know, economics should be about understanding that kind of thing. And we don't understand it as well as we would like to understand it. I think that would be the general consensus statement. Credit markets locked up. One of the things that I have done in my other life is I'm on the board of corporations which care a lot about credit, and they locked up. You know, you couldn't get loans. I knew people who had very, very successful businesses, and they, you know, had been paying off their loans for years and years and years, and they were rated AAA, and all of a sudden these people couldn't get loans. And you know, they may have depended on loans to do their business. They may have been in the auto rental business. The way the auto rental business works is you get a loan and you buy cars, and people show up and they rent your cars and you pay back people, right? These are people who couldn't get loans. These are really businesses shut down. So, big thing to understand, Nash, John Nash, won the Nobel Prize. Amazing movie, by the way. A Beautiful Mind is really worth seeing. And if you get the DVD, it has material with John Nash giving a lecture. I show that in my game theory class. It's the same lecture that I give in game theory, so it's quite terrific. So John Nash was interested in this kind of problem of what happens when two people get together to exchange, and that's where you can see most basically this problem of, will people doing the best for themselves, will that promote the social good? So, I'm not going to pick on the two of you again. I know him well, but I'm going to pick on him anyhow. So I'll pick on the two of you. So here's the problem. The problem is you come together to trade. You're the seller, and you have an object that is worth 0 to you. You don't value it. And you're the buyer, and you have an object that, and you would like the object, and it's worth 1 to you. And so there's the possibility for gain here. What should happen is that the seller gives it to the buyer. The question is, at what price? Okay? If there's 1 unit of surplus, they could split the surplus. And in fact, what some of you might say is, well, you know, fairness is an important principle. You know, if we have the two of you coming together, you might just say, okay, we understand that there's a unit of surplus, let's split the surplus. Let's do it right away. It's not a stupid outcome. Now, let's make it a little bit more interesting. It's $10,000 of surplus value, and you don't know each other, and you'll never see each other again, and you're going to bargain hard. And let's make it even a little bit more interesting than that. Let's say that as time goes by, there's some kind of discounting. You'd rather get the surplus today than get it later. Let's say if 10 days go by, then half the surplus is gone. How will you behave? You'll never see each other again. You'd never saw each other before. It's all done a little bit more anonymously. We're abstracting from the fact that you could go off and try and find other buyers. So it's pretty narrow, okay? So this problem, these things are quite interesting. This problem was only taken up in good, rigorous way that gave a nice solution by at least both mathematical ideas and what made sense and what might happen. And there's work by Stahl and Ariel Rubinstein. You know, very important for you to always look at who's around this place. In the last week, we had Thomas Piketty, who's been, and is he still visiting Harris? Well, he's here, you know, now and then. I think he's visiting Harris. He gave a talk here. You will continually have access to such remarkable people, even beyond your remarkable professors, and you should make use of this kind of thing. In any case, Rubinstein was here. He wasn't talking about this kind of thing, but he solved the game theoretic problem putting into place a model. The model was suggested by Stahl, but he took it a little further. And he said, okay, let's look at it this way. I'll let you make an offer of division of the surplus, and then it'll be your job to say whether you accept it or not. And if you say not, then you get to make an offer of division of the surplus, a price at which the exchange takes place, and you can say yes or no, etc. And it goes on. It turns out to be a not unsophisticated game. And in basic courses in game theory, you learn that there's a unique subgame perfect equilibrium of the game. It depends on relative impatience. I set the relative impatience equal in this case. And if there's little time between offers, which means that the discounting per period is small, then this game will settle immediately with you making an offer which is, I want approximately half of the surplus, and it being accepted. If they had different impatience, then in fact, the relative impatience would be reflected in the original offer that's made. But it's a difficult theorem. To prove that mathematically, you have to understand subgame perfect equilibrium, which isn't too hard. You have to understand infinite games. To do the mathematics of it, you would need, you know, analysis comes in 3 flavors here. You would need the middle analysis course, okay? You really would have to understand compact sets, and you'd really be using your mathematics. So it's a highly non-trivial theorem. He knows the proof. So there are a few of you here who know the proof, but it's not all that simple. Did I give a reasonable account?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the big thing in that result was that it said that there wouldn't be delay to agreement. It said there wouldn't be any period during which both lost out because there was discounting. If it would have settled in the 5th period, if it was possible for there to be an equilibrium that settled in the 5th period, then it would be worth less. There'd be less to divide. You'd be getting your money later, okay? And you'd be getting the good later, okay? So that would be burning surplus. So it's a result which modeled the idea of bargaining, modeled it in a very special way. You know, you could also say, okay, I'll let you shout out offers, and I'll let you shout out responses anytime you want to, and people could be speaking on top of each other. So you sort of have to make assumptions to get a rigorous handle on this. But this is taken to be a very successful way of dealing with that. Now, there's a real problem, because the world, and this now starts taking you into the research that interests me, and it also introduces the work of one of your professors, Roger Myerson. This is a reasonably close description of what wins a Nobel Prize. It's quite amazing. And a little bit unfair because I'll develop it a bit more, but it's at the same time somewhat breathtaking. Take the same situation that I talked about, but let's make it a bit more realistic and a little bit more interesting. Let's see, there's a pointer. Look at that. Okay. So let's assume that the value to you, instead of being 0, is either 0 or 8. You could think of you have to buy this, and you're either buying it at price 0 or price 8 before you go into this little game where you're involved in selling it, okay? And the value to the buyer is either 2 or 10. So most of the time, the buyer values it more than the seller. There's one sell, and the 0.5, 0.5 are probabilities. So there's one cell, think of these as IID. This happens with probability 1/4, where the seller has a higher valuation than the buyer, and it shouldn't trade. So when these two people sit down to bargain, they don't know whether they're in a situation where it should trade. Should trade here, should trade here, should trade here. That's evident? Everybody with me? Okay, but 1/4 of the time, it shouldn't trade. If you calculate out the surplus that's available, well, 1/4 of the time there's no surplus, 1/4 of the time there's 2 surplus, 1/4 of the time 2 surplus, 1/4 of the time 10 surplus. So there's actually an expected value, 7/2 surplus here. But you don't know whether there's a situation where there's surplus or not. And you know, without really having met before, large amounts of money, and you're really not caring about the person you're playing with, you might sit down as you start to bargain and say, well, you know, I want the buyer to believe that this cost me 8 and that I'm not an eager seller. And similarly, you may want the seller to believe that you only have valuation 2 and you're not an eager buyer. And it might take a little bit of time to actually work that out. But I could look at the same game that we talked about a moment ago. You offer a price, okay? Yes, no. If no, then you can counteroffer a price. And the difference between this game and the game that I put up before that Rubinstein solved is very, very large. The fact is that there is no equilibrium of this game with alternating offers, which can settle every time, right away, every time it should. What does that mean? Well, the way that we talk about these things is nature picks values for each independently. Here it should settle right away. Here it should settle right away. Here it should settle right away, and here it shouldn't settle. There is no equilibrium of this game. Now, equilibrium is more than subgame perfect equilibrium. Now you're at the end of the first-year undergraduate course, and you're talking about sequential equilibrium, weak sequential equilibrium, and you're moving right along in terms of learning game theory. So even the mathematical formulation of equilibrium in games where this is called asymmetric information. The way it works is the seller knows what the cost was to her, and the buyer knows what the value is to him, but they don't know the costs or values of the other person. Okay, that's the asymmetric information. You know, even Roger Myerson is a major force in pushing the understanding of that. He and Phil Rennie, who's another major force, Phil Rennie teaching here, are really writing papers on the frontiers of how to think about these kinds of games. But no matter how you think about it, it was Meyerson's basic understanding of this kind of thing, and in this particular instance, formulated with Mark Satterthwaite, who's at Northwestern University, another prominent economist in game theorist, which shows there's just no way of doing this. And getting trade right away every time you should, which means there's waste, okay? So getting back to basic learning, this is a story where game theory tells us that the invisible hand doesn't do so well. It can't lead to trade right away every time it should lead to trade right away. So, you know, we're trying to turn you into sophisticated people. I don't know what the answer is to what we should have done to avoid 2008, but I'm trying to understand where the basic hooks are, what the basic principles are, what I should know in order to opine on these big subjects. In fact, this is exactly what labor economists use to explain strikes. They say, why do strikes happen? They happen because of asymmetric information. Okay. The worker doesn't know the value to management of getting that strike done with. And management doesn't know the cost to the worker of sitting out and striking. Those are private information. And that private information leads to worlds where straight out bargaining will not lead necessarily to efficiency. It can't lead to efficiency in this case. Okay. If you take it a step further, you have the world of mechanism design. Does anybody have a question before I go on? We're going to end very soon. Don't worry. Okay. So the world of mechanism design, this is the little calculation to prove this Meyerson-Satterthwaite result. But the world of mechanism design, and this really is Roger Meyerson's world and invention, says the best thing that you can do here is just have somebody who stands up there and says, I know the uncertainty, I don't know the valuations that each one of you have, but I'm going to have you play a game. And the game is going to be this. It's going to be when a person declares that she's a 0 and the other person declares that he's a 2, then they will trade 5/6 of the time at a price of 2, and et cetera. And that imposed game is a way of sucking out as much surplus as you can. But notice you're not sucking out all the surplus, because there are cases where you should trade, but you only trade 5/6 of the time. Okay, so that, you know, this is an introduction to how game theorists get their hands on this kind of problem. Okay, what is Sonnenschein interested in? What does he do? Let me turn to that now in just concluding minutes. I'm going to quickly run by a couple of things here. So what I and my colleagues have tried to develop is a theory of negotiation. And instead of it just being the kind of problem we looked at here, where there's one, let's say, object to be exchanged, you look at problems that are a little bit more multidimensional, a little bit more like the world. So the beans were spilled. I was once president of the university. Okay. And as president of the university, I need somebody now else to, I'm going to work with you now. I would do things like hire, this is terrible, I'm not so sure I should do this on the air, but you hire a dean of the medical school. Now, deans of medical schools typically make more than presidents of universities. They make money like corporate, high-level corporate. They make millions and millions of dollars. I'm not talking about Chicago, but wherever, okay? And in fact, when you negotiate with them, the kind of negotiation you have, let's say there's a woman who is a candidate to be dean, and we talk this way. We say, look, there are many things that you might care about. You might care about your wage, sure, but you might care about a job for your husband who's a physicist. We have a very good physics department at Chicago, and they might be willing, if I help things along a little bit, to hire your husband. I hear he's, you're at Yale, and I hear he's quite good, and we'd be pleased to have him in the department. And housing, of course, is important, and we provide rather generous housing arrangements, especially for high-level people. So, mortgages, we can help. We can give you a very, very low rate, arrange that. And you may care about being able to hire outstanding people, and so at the very beginning, you're going to need something like $40 million to sprinkle around and bring people here from Yale and other places. And on the other hand, I don't know how valuable each one of these dimensions are to you, and you don't know how costly they are to me. So for example, you may have in your mind that, boy, you're going to walk around, and every time you see somebody, you're going to put your hand on their shoulder, and you're going to say, well, tell me about your family history. Anybody in your family who has a disease? And this is what medical school deans do. And you quickly find out that everybody has somebody in their family who needs medical care. But some of those people may be graduates of the law school. And I may have a dean of the law school who will kill me if I turn over a wealthy prospect to a medical school dean. So there's an issue of who you'll have access to raise money. So the point is there are many dimensions when you are involved in a real negotiation. If it's a union management negotiation, what are the many dimensions? Well, you might care about wages for different classes of workers. You might care about medical benefits. You might care about under what conditions can management go outside to hire labor. These are multidimensional contracts. And the real problem in a negotiation is to find out which things are relatively valuable for you and relatively inexpensive for me. What can we include in the contract? What's the right contract? And so this is a list taken from a book of thinking through this kind of thing. And as just really a final part, because I want to let you ask questions, I can do a little bit more, both experimentally with some of my co-authors and theoretically, we think about situations where instead of there being, let's do it a little bit differently than the labor management, instead of there being one object that you're selling, let's think of rugs, there are 12 of them, and the first rug may have a cost to you of 8, the second 0, the third 8, the fourth 0. I just took numbers IID, equal probability 8 or 0. And on the other hand, you may have valuations which are these. And if you had some independence, the expected value on each of these, or the expected value for long strings if things are IID, is kind of determinate. You sort of know what the gains should be. Your problem is you don't know where they can be found, okay? So we model this, and it turns out that if one looks at negotiation as a multi-dimensional process, then not just in this kind of situation, but in other situations where the total surplus per rug is not even known, you can do much better than would be suggested by the Meyerson, Satterthwaite, matrix that I was putting up there in getting to agreement. So what's it really about? It's a take on to what extent can people negotiating extract out surplus, okay? Extract out full surplus, especially when there's uncertainty and when there's asymmetric information. Is it as bad as is suggested by Myers and Satterthwaite? Is it as bad as is used in labor economics to explain strikes? Or is the fact that these things are multidimensional a bit of a saving grace? If it's a bit of a saving grace, then maybe the invisible hand gets a few points. You know, I mean, my own feeling is there are points where there are places where the invisible hand does pretty nicely and where it does pretty poorly. And I'm trying to understand the boundaries of where it does nicely and where it does poorly. One of the things that I want you to take away is these are unsolved problems. Okay, this is not you know, this is a very alive subject, and understanding the extent to which we want to allow markets to argue, to just work without mediation, understanding the extent to which we want to intervene, when we want to intervene, how we want to intervene, that takes you back to the most basic questions in economics. And these questions are alive. I find it a bit chilling that in my department, which is, of course, the best department, the best economics department, if I go around and I say, okay, well, you know, if people get together to bargain, do you believe they'll suck out all the surplus or not? There's just a little bit of predictability in terms of when I go to certain people, I know they'll be pretty optimistic, and I go to others and I think they'll be a little less optimistic. But what matters? When should we intervene? Under what circumstances? This is as much political science as it is economics. You know, the arguments about when to intervene can affect what people will do politically, even though then you have another bargaining problem where people are figuring out how good the interventions will be for them. So, but I hope this will show you that, you know, our subject is very alive. You should push back hard because what we do is hard stuff. We are correctly urging you to build analytic tools. It's not because these analytic tools will solve all of these hard problems, but it's because they're serious and complicated problems. And it's pretty hard to know how to even begin to attack them without some analytic framework. It's, you know, it's great to have you here. I tried to end it early enough so you can ask a question or two. Yes?
If we want to learn more about like game theory, what books would you suggest to read?
Okay, so the book that both Roger Myerson and I have used when we've taught game theory, and I think it's been the book that's been used, is a book by Osborne called Introduction to Game Theory. It's quite an accessible book. It's a textbook. It has tons and tons of problems. Now, at the same time, I really would urge you to look at more popular accounts. And in terms of what I'm doing here, and in terms of trying to think how things will develop in the future, I really would push you to books like Misbehaving Like Thaler, which is about as much about decision theory as it is about game theory. What else would I recommend? Hey, guys in the back, help me out. What do you answer when people ask you about basic game theory books? There are now a bunch of decent. Yep.
Gibbons' book.
Whose?
Gibbons, Robert Gibbons.
Gibbons. That's a very good book. What's the title of it again? That's another analytic book. I was looking for something which was, would give you a chatty introduction, and I'm not doing well.
Game Theory for Applied Economists by Gibbons.
Oh, Game Theory for Applied Economists by Gibbons. Still pretty analytic. How about a popular book? What's a good popular book? All right, I'm doing badly. It's a good question.
If you have questions, let me know later, or no?
Yeah, I'll give you, I'll think about it and do some more. Anybody else? Well, eat, enjoy, I'll stay up here and you, question? Nope, okay. All right. You're at a great school and you're remarkable people. And I'm an old man, I'm 75 tomorrow, which is probably the age of your grandparents. And I have I shouldn't say this, I do have a grandson here, but he doesn't come near economics. You won't see him in any of your courses. And there's a very talented son of Grace who took game theory and is now at MIT in graduate school. So take statistics, take mathematics, but concentrate on what it's all about. What is this all about? And there are lots of parts of social equilibrium. I gave a talk last night, and it was an alumni event, not of this university, and it was, what should you study? And it got into a discussion of what should we teach? One of the things that's happening in universities is the number of people who are studying the humanities and the less formal social sciences is kind of dwindling. And in general, when you get to first jobs, there's a pretty good premium for doing economics. You'll be doing this for a long time in your life, whatever you wind up doing. And don't just go into, there are great jobs there. It's really important to think about why you're interested, what big issues are, what your role will be in society. Writing well is really important. Arguing well is really important. And don't forget those parts. He studies philosophy. I mean, what I was talking about today is basically philosophy, which I find very attractive. So, okay, I'll stay down here. Thank you very much.